In the high country of Colorado, in the autumn of 1888, the talk of the valley wasn't about the price of timber or the coming winter. It was about the widow. Her name was Alara Vance, and people were sure she'd been driven mad by grief. Riders on the high trail would stop their horses and just stare down at the old, failed slate quarry her husband had bought sight unseen. Down there, this small woman and her two young boys, no older than 10, were hauling jagged plates of dark gray rock. They weren't building a cabin, not a proper one. They were digging into the hillside, laying a foundation of stone, and stacking walls of slate scrap like a madman building a fortress. From the trail, it looked like a tomb, low to the ground, dark, with almost no windows. Jedediah, a trapper who'd seen more strange things than most, called it Vance's Folly. The name stuck. By the first frost, every man who stopped for a drink at the saloon had an opinion. The stone would sweat. It would draw the cold. The roof would collapse under the first heavy snow. It was a death trap. They saw a monument to a woman's foolishness. They saw a grave she was building for herself and her children. What they couldn't see, what they couldn't possibly understand, was the quiet, unshakable confidence in Alara's eyes. They saw worthless rock. She saw a battery for the sun. And when the winter of 1888 hit, a winter that would go down in the record books as the Great Freeze, that strange stone house would be put to the test. It wouldn't just be a test of a building, it would be a test of an idea that would produce a number, a single, impossible number that would make the most experienced builders in the entire county go completely silent. What did this quiet widow from a foreign land understand about warmth, about shelter, about the very physics of survival that every man in that valley had missed? If you want to hear that story, and you want to know that number, stay with me. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We tell stories like this every week. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Alara Vance wasn't trying to start a revolution. She was a 32-year-old widow just trying to keep her sons alive. She'd come from a small quarry town in Wales, a place where the hills were made of slate and the cottages were made of stone. Her husband, Thomas, was a man full of big American dreams. He'd spent their last savings on a flyer promising a mountain of premium architectural slate in the Colorado Rockies. He died of pneumonia in a boarding house in St. Louis before he ever laid eyes on it. So Alara and her sons, 8-year-old Liam and 6-year-old Finn, finished the journey alone. They arrived in the valley with 2 trunks and a deed to a piece of land nobody wanted. The quarry was a bust. The slate was fractured, good for nothing but gravel. The only building was a derelict prospector's shack, thin-walled and drafty, a sieve pretending to be a shelter. That first autumn in the shack was a brutal education. Colorado cold was different from the damp chill of Wales. It was a dry, biting, invasive cold carried on a wind that never seemed to stop. The wind was the real enemy. It didn't just make the air cold, it actively stole heat. It forced its way through every crack in the shack's log walls, a process called convective heat loss. It was like trying to stay warm in a basket. She burned through the wood Thomas had arranged for at an alarming rate. The small stove glowed red, but the heat simply vanished into the walls and out through the roof. Liam and Finn slept in their coats, huddled together. Every morning, the water in the bucket by the door was frozen solid. Alara would sit by the weak fire long after the boys were asleep, feeling the warmth being stripped away, and a cold fear began to settle in her heart. This place, This method of building was designed for the heavily forested, less windy East. Here, in the high, exposed mountains, it was a recipe for slow failure. But Alara had a different education. She was the daughter of a quarryman. She hadn't read books on thermodynamics, but she had a lifetime of observing stone. She remembered her father's cottage back in Wales. It was built of thick stone, and on the coldest days it held a deep, steady warmth. It took a long time to heat, but once warm, it stayed warm for hours. Her father used to say, "The wood gives you a quick heat, girl. The stone gives you a long one." One afternoon, she was sitting outside the failed quarry, watching the pale autumn sun. The air was cold, but when she placed her hand on a large, dark slab of slate, it was faintly warm. Hours later, long after the sun had dipped behind the peaks, she went back and touched it again. The air was frigid. The wood of the shack was ice cold. But the slate? The slate still held a ghost of the day's warmth. That was the moment the idea took root. The thought nagged at her, a simple, powerful observation. Wood burns, it releases its energy quickly and is gone. But stone holds energy. It absorbs it, stores it, and releases it slowly. It had what scientists would later call high thermal mass. Everyone in the valley saw the forest and thought of fuel and lumber. They saw the mountain of broken slate as a worthless ruin. Alara looked at the same landscape and saw something different. She saw the wood as the kindling, and the stone was the hearth. The entire house could be the hearth. Her plan formed, born of desperation and deep-seated knowledge. She wouldn't try to fight the cold with a bigger fire. That was a losing battle. Instead, she would build a battery for heat, made of the very rock everyone else had thrown away. She would build a shelter that worked with the landscape, not against it. She would build it into the earth to escape the wind, and she would build it out of stone to hold the sun. Her sons needed more than a fire. They needed a reservoir of warmth, and she would build it for them, one rock at a time. She started in the late spring, as soon as the ground thawed. She had no money to hire help, no funds for milled lumber or glass. All she had was her own 2 hands, the help of her young sons, and a literal mountain of free material. First, she chose the spot, not on the flat, exposed ground, but halfway up a south-facing hillside. This was a deliberate choice. By digging into the earth, she could use the planet itself as insulation. The ground maintains a relatively stable temperature, around 50 to 55 degrees, year-round. 3 sides of her home would be shielded from the relentless wind before she even laid a single stone. Liam and Finn, too small for heavy lifting, dug with small shovels, their faces smudged with dirt, turning it into a game. Then came the walls. This was the heart of her design. She wasn't a mason, so she didn't use mortar. She used a technique she'd seen in the old country, dry stacking. She and the boys gathered thousands of flat, broken pieces of slate. She laid 2 parallel walls, about 2 feet apart, creating a cavity between them. This was slow, brutal work. Her hands became calloused, then cracked and bleeding. But every day, the walls grew, inch by inch. As the walls rose, she filled the gap between them, not with mortar, but with a mix of crushed slate gravel and the driest soil she could find. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. That 2-foot-thick filling wasn't just for stability, it was for insulation. The trapped air and dry material created a massive buffer against the outside cold. Moving air strips heat, but still air is one of the best insulators there is. She was building the principle of a double-pane window into the very core of her walls. One afternoon, Liam looked at the thick gray structure and asked, Mama, are we building a cave? Alara stopped, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty hand. She smiled. A warm cave, love. A dragon's lair to keep us safe from the winter. The centerpiece of the entire structure was the hearth. In the middle of the small single-room space, she built a massive chimney base out of the largest, thickest slabs of slate she could move with levers and rollers. This was not just a fireplace. It was the engine of the house. It was a thermal battery. The idea was simple. A fire burned in a traditional log cabin heats the air. Once the fire goes out, the warm air leaks away, and the house gets cold again. But this was different. The fire in her hearth would heat the tons of stone surrounding it. Slate is dense. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of BTUs, to raise its temperature. But once you do, it holds that energy for a very, very long time. The stone itself would become the heater, radiating a steady, gentle warmth back into the room for hours, even long after the flames had died down to embers. The roof was the most difficult part. She used the few sound timbers she could salvage from the old shack, creating a low-pitched frame. Then she and the boys began the painstaking work of splitting the better pieces of slate into rough tiles. They laid them in overlapping courses, just as she'd seen on the roofs in Wales. The weight of the slate itself held the tiles in place. Finally, the windows. Glass was a luxury she couldn't afford, but more importantly, she knew windows were holes where heat escaped. So she made only 3. They were small, no bigger than a bread box, and all of them faced south. This was an intuitive form of passive solar design. In the winter, the sun hangs low in the southern sky. Its rays would shine directly into the small windows, warming the dark slate floor and the massive hearth inside, adding to the thermal battery each day for free. By the time the first aspen leaves began to turn yellow, it was finished. The structure looked like nothing else in the valley. It was low, dark, and seemed to grow directly out of the hillside. From a distance, it looked less like a house and more like a natural rock formation with a stovepipe sticking out of it. The total cost was under $5 for a handful of nails and a used length of pipe she'd bought from a failed miner. The rest was paid in sweat and stone. Finn, her youngest, stood in the dim interior on the first day and said, "It's dark, Mama." Alara knelt and put her hands on his shoulders, her voice soft but firm. "It will be warm, Finn. This winter, it will be warm. That's all that matters." The ridicule started before the first snow. When her neighbors saw the finished structure, they didn't see engineering, they saw insanity. The first official visit was from Marcus Thorne. Thorne owned the lumber mill and had built, or at least supplied the wood for, half the cabins in the valley. He was a big man, confident in his knowledge of how things were done. He rode up to the slate house, his horse snorting in the crisp autumn air, and surveyed the building with a look of profound pity. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "I don't mean to tell you your business, but that stone is going to draw the cold right into your bones. It'll sweat with frost on the inside. You'll freeze to death in that thing. There's no proper chinking." He was operating on the conventional wisdom that stone was cold and wood was warm. Alara simply stood in the doorway, her hands clasped. "The stone holds the heat, Mr. Thorne," she replied calmly. "It doesn't leak it like wood." Thorne just shook his head and rode away. He told everyone at the saloon that the poor woman was confusing a root cellar with a house. The public insult came a week later at the general store. Alara was trading a few eggs for flour when Silas, a grizzled old trapper known for his loud mouth, pointed a thumb in her direction. "That the woman livin' in the Welsh witch's cairn?" he boomed, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few men snickered. Alara ignored him, paid for her flour, and left, her face a mask of composure. But the name stuck. Gossip became a local pastime. People would ride out on a Sunday just to stare at the strange house, dug into the hill. They'd point and whisper. They said she was trying to bury her children before the winter did it for her. The institutional concern came from Mr. Gable, the county commissioner. He was a man who believed in regulations and right angles, and Alara's house had neither. He made a formal visit, his buggy looking deeply out of place next to the pile of slate rubble. "Mrs. Vance," he began, clearing his throat, "I have concerns for your children's welfare. This structure isn't a proper home. It doesn't meet any standard I'm familiar with." "It is strong and it is dry," Alara said, her voice level, "and it will be warm." Gable left, shaking his head and making notes in a small book. He was convinced he'd be back in January to escort 2 orphans to the state home. But the cut that went deepest came not from a stranger, but from family. A letter arrived from her late husband's sister, back in Ohio. It was filled with panicked concern that felt more like an accusation. "We hear you've built a house of rock," it read. "For God's sake, Alara, sell that worthless land and come back before you kill those boys. People will think you're either incompetent or insane." That night, Liam saw the letter and the look on his mother's face. "Are they laughing at us, Mama?" he asked. Alara folded the letter and put it in the fire. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "They don't understand stone," she said simply. "We do." By the end of October, the consensus in the valley was absolute. Alara Vance, the grieving widow, hadn't built a shelter. She'd built a monument to her own folly, a tomb. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Alara right. It changed how this entire valley thought about the very meaning of shelter. Then November came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1888 to 89 is still recorded in Colorado's climatology archives. It wasn't just a cold winter, it was a siege. It started with a snap. November 20th, the thermometer at the general store read -10 degrees Fahrenheit. The old-timers nodded. "A tough one," they said. By December 5th, it was -25. The talk grew quieter. Then, the week before Christmas, a massive Arctic high-pressure system stalled over the Rocky Mountains. The sky turned a strange, brilliant cloudless blue, and the bottom fell out of the world. For 19 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never once climbed above 0. At night, it plunged to -30, then -35. The wind started, a merciless gale out of the north that drove the wind chill to 50, then 60 below. Snow didn't fall so much as it flew horizontally, driven by a force so relentless that it scoured the paint from the north side of the church. Drifts buried fences, then sheds, then reached the eaves of cabins. The valley, with its sturdy traditional log homes, began to break down. The cold was a physical pressure, finding every unchinked crack, every poorly fitted door. Marcus Thorne, in his large, handsome house, was burning a cord of prime, seasoned hardwood every 5 days. His wife and daughters lived in a small circle around the stove. The rest of the house was an icebox. The temperature on their wall hovered at 45 degrees. They considered that a victory. Others were not so lucky. The Miller family's chimney, caked with creosote from burning green wood, became blocked with ice and soot. They had to put their fire out or risk burning the whole cabin down. They huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air inside their own home. Ranchers began losing cattle, finding them frozen solid in the fields, standing up. Survival became a desperate, full-time job. The sound of axes echoed constantly as men struggled to cut more and more wood. They were burning it as fast as they could chop it. Some started burning furniture. It was a brutal equation of constant labor just to keep from freezing. And then people started noticing something strange, or rather, a lack of something strange. At the Vance Quarry, there was no sign of panic. A rider, making a desperate run to check on a neighbor, got turned around in the blizzard and found himself on the ridge overlooking Alara's land. Through the blowing snow, he saw it, a single, thin plume of smoke rising calmly from the stone pipe on the roof. Not the thick, billowing smoke of a desperate, roaring fire, but a steady, economical wisp. As he watched, the door of the stone house opened. Alara Vance stepped out. She was not wearing a heavy parka. She was in a thick woolen shawl over her dress. She walked to her small woodpile, calmly split a few logs for about 10 minutes, stacked them, and went back inside. She didn't look like she was fighting a war against the cold. She looked like she was doing her morning chores. The rider went back to town and told his story. No one believed him. They couldn't. It didn't make any sense. If you're still here, stay with me, because the number that came out of that stone house didn't just silence the doubters. It redefined survival in the high country. The breaking point for Marcus Thorne came on December 23rd. The temperature that morning was 38 below zero, not counting the wind. His wife had been crying because their youngest daughter had a hacking cough that wouldn't quit, and the cabin was so cold they could see their breath in the main room. He was a proud man, a successful man, but his house, built of the finest lumber his own mill could produce, was failing, and his family was suffering. He remembered the rider's story about the widow Vance. It gnawed at him. He dismissed it as a fever dream, a trick of the blowing snow. But a sliver of doubt remained. Finally, spurred by a mix of guilt, curiosity, and a genuine fear that he might find a tragedy, he loaded a sled with emergency cordwood, hitched his strongest horse, and made the brutal journey to the quarry. He fought his way through waist-deep drifts, the wind cutting through his thick coat. When he finally saw the low, snow-covered shape of the Slate house, he felt a deep dread. There was no sign of life, save for that same impossibly thin ribbon of smoke. He expected the worst. He hammered on the thick wooden door, shouting against the wind. The door opened. Alara Vance stood there, and the first thing that hit Marcus Thorne was the warmth. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove. It was a wave of steady, silent, radiant warmth. It washed over him like he'd stepped into a different season. He blinked, stunned. Behind her, through the opening to the cabin's interior, Thorne saw her two boys. They were sitting at a small wooden table, reading a book by the light of a kerosene lamp. They were wearing normal shirts and trousers, not coats, not blankets, shirts. He was so stunned he forgot why he'd come. "Everything all right?" he stammered. Alara looked at him, then at the cordwood on his sled. A flicker of understanding crossed her face. "We're fine, Mr. Thorne. We're managing fine. But please, come in out of that wind." He stepped inside. The air was warm and still. The silence was the most shocking part. In his own home, the stove roared and the wind howled. Here, there was just the quiet crackle of a small, efficiently burning fire in the massive stone hearth. He looked around the single, dim room. It was sparse, but it wasn't a place of suffering. It was a place of calm. "How?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "How are you? How are you doing this? My stove has been burning white hot for 2 weeks." Elara gestured to the hearth. "A small fire in the morning to cook, and a larger one in the evening before bed. The stone does the rest." She pointed to her small woodpile inside. "We're using maybe a quarter of a cord a week." Thorne stared at her. A quarter of a cord a week. He was burning that in a single day, and his house was 20 degrees colder. The math didn't work. It was impossible. His eyes scanned the room and landed on a small thermometer hanging on an interior wall, far from the direct heat of the fire. He walked over to it as if in a trance. He squinted in the dim light to read the mercury. It sat, clear and steady, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees? Outside, the air temperature was 38 below zero, a difference of 106 degrees. Thorne reached out a trembling hand and touched the stone wall next to the thermometer. It wasn't slick with frost, as he had predicted. It wasn't even cold. It was faintly, impossibly warm to the touch. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't argue with it. He was physically feeling the evidence. The narrator can now lay out the data with authority. The Thorne house, 2 cords of wood a month to hold 45 degrees. The Miller cabin, before their chimney failed, 1.5 cords a month to hold 40. The Vance house, 1 cord of wood a month, holding a steady 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. The rest of the valley was desperately trying to bail out the cold. Elara Vance had built a boat. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about dignity. Her children weren't huddled and shivering. They were reading. They were living. The system turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. Thorne stood there for a long time, just looking from the small, calm fire to the impossibly warm walls. He, the master builder, the expert on timber, had been so profoundly, completely wrong. He finally turned to Elara, his face a mixture of awe and shame. "My God," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "we've been building with the wrong material all along." A week later, after the worst of the storm broke, County Commissioner Gable arrived with 2 other men. It was an official welfare check. He came prepared with blankets and grim duty. He also brought a calibrated thermometer from his office. When Elara let them in, they were met with the same shocking wave of warmth. Gable, a man of process, didn't speak. He simply placed his instrument on the table and waited. After 10 minutes, he checked the reading. It was 67 degrees. He checked it again. He stared at the walls, at the small fire, at the healthy-looking children, and for the first time in his bureaucratic life, he was utterly speechless. Elara then showed him her small ledger, where she'd meticulously recorded the daily temperature and the wood consumed. It wasn't a miracle. It was physics. By spring, the story was legend. Vance's folly was now spoken of with a kind of reverence, simply called the Slate House. The talk wasn't of the widow's madness anymore. It was of her genius. The first to convert was a young German farmer named Schmidt. His newborn baby had been sick with a lung ailment all through the brutal winter. his own small cabin a drafty nightmare. He didn't come to Alara for advice. He came, hat in hand, and asked for permission to gather scrap slate from her quarry. Alara did more than that. She walked with him, showed him the principles, how to dig into the hill, how to build the double wall, how to orient the house to the south. The Schmidts built a smaller, cruder version that summer. It wasn't as well crafted as Ilara's, but it was based on the same sound principles. The following winter, which was cold by any normal standard, the Schmidts' home was the second warmest in the valley. Their child was healthy and strong. That was the only proof anyone else needed. 3 more slate houses went up the next year, 7 the year after that. They became a local variation, a testament to a lesson learned the hard way. They were never beautiful, but they were warm. They were shelters born of the landscape itself. Commissioner Gable, the man who had threatened to remove her children, became her greatest advocate. He wrote a detailed report for the State Agricultural Extension Service. It was titled Principles of Thermal Mass Construction for High-Altitude Dwellings, and it included Alara's meticulous data on fuel consumption and temperature. He credited her design fully. What Alara Vance had built from memory and instinct was a near-perfect example of passive solar design and thermal mass engineering. These were principles that wouldn't be rediscovered and named by architects and engineers for another 70 years. She was decades ahead of her time, not because she was an inventor, but because she was a careful observer who trusted ancient knowledge over fashionable convention. Years later, when Marcus Thorne had built his own, much larger home with a thick stone core based on her design, he tried to praise her ingenuity. She simply shook her head. "This isn't new, Marcus," she said, her Welsh accent still present. "In the old country, we've always known. The earth and the stone are warmer than the wind." The original slate house still stands today, covered in moss, looking more like a part of the hill than ever. It's a quiet monument, not to one person, but to an idea. The idea that the most elegant solutions are often found by observing, not by imposing. The log cabin was a tradition, an idea brought from the forested east. For the high, wind-swept Rockies, it was the wrong idea. Alara didn't have a better theory. She just paid closer attention to the reality of her new home. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition. It rewarded what worked. Drop a comment below. What's the coldest winter you can remember? And what were the traditional ways people in your area stayed warm? Subscribe for more stories of forgotten ingenuity every week. And give this video a like if it changed the way you think about a simple rock. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters and specific events are fictional, created for the purposes of illustrating a narrative. However, the underlying principles of thermal mass, passive solar design, earth sheltering, and insulation are based on real, proven building science and historical construction techniques from around the world.